Well, I remember Bert Viskovich, Public Works Director, and I were standing there and wondering how bad was it. The buildings were still standing that we could see.
We set up TV and radio in the Emergency Operations Center and started picking up some of the pictures of the Bay Bridge collapse.
I think our public safety response agencies, our police and fire, responded very well. This is what they do on a daily basis. They're well practiced.
October 17th, 1989, a date we'll all remember. A major earthquake strikes Northern California, the largest in over 80 years. We all certainly remember what happened throughout the Bay Area, but what happened here, specifically in Cupertino? In the next half hour, we will be joined by Cupertino City Manager Don Brown, Administrative Specialist Pat Jocius, and Fire Chief Ben Lopes from the Central Fire Protection District. But first, we'll take a look back. October 17th, 5:04 p.m.
Los Gatos Command Control.
Telephone service has been restored to our office. I don't know how we are here. But, there's a lot going on, and it looks like it's going to go on for a while.
There's nobody on the street. Get through real easy. Every intersection, everybody.
These scenes are of Cupertino City Hall, the evening of October 17th, 1989, as a major earthquake rocked Northern California. The quake, which registered 7.1 on the Richter scale, was located 10 miles northeast of Santa Cruz. It was responsible for at least 70 deaths throughout the Bay Area as buildings and overpasses gave way from Santa Cruz and Los Gatos north into Oakland and San Francisco. Billions of dollars in damage were recorded statewide. It was the worst natural disaster to strike the nation since the 1906 San Francisco quake, which left nearly 800 dead. During the post-quake period, city officials were faced with a number of real live emergencies. One of the more serious incidents following the quake was this structure fire at 7556 Orange Blossom Drive in South Cupertino. The fire produced a large plume that could be seen for miles along the western side of the valley. Neighbor Norman Wild returned home to find the fire raging out of control just across the street.
Don Faust, he did a major part in saving that house right next to the right of it, because he got up there with a hose and he was hosing the corner of that roof down so that wouldn't get there.
Other incidents included an unconfirmed report of a landslide at Deep Cliffs Golf Course, several reports of buildings cracking or slipping on their foundations, and reports of numerous electrical outages and gas leaks. One of the biggest problems to affect Cupertino occurred when operations at the Rancho Rinconada water treatment plant were reduced to 1/3 of normal following the quake.
There is some damage to this treatment plant, and it is affecting our water supply. We're asking residents who have San Jose Water and Cal Water to conserve as much as possible. That means no showers and definitely no outdoor watering.
Cupertino has a limited water supply. Please try and conserve as much water as possible. Thank you.
During the first few days after the quake, Public Works personnel canvassed the community, informing citizens about the water emergency.
We are still in effect in the drought, and now that we had the earthquake and the water breaks, we're just trying to let everybody be aware.
Okay, sounds good.
Is the water potable here?
Yes, the water in Cupertino is safe. We're in between the two major areas of Los Gatos and San Francisco. We didn't have the sewer line damage like both of those cities.
Yeah.
but just to be on the safe side, you know.
Interior damage to homes and businesses was also extensive. Tin Tin Market, like many other Cupertino businesses, was closed for days as cleanup operations got underway. At the Cupertino Library, volumes upon volumes of books littered the floor. The library remained closed as personnel began refiling and repairing the books. Here in Cupertino, more than $58 million in damage was attributed to the quake, most of it in the commercial and industrial sectors. In residential areas, very little structural damage was experienced, aside from a few cracked foundations and toppled chimney columns.
The damage that we've experienced is mostly cosmetic, cracks in the sheetrock, stress cracks. The biggest problem we've had is in the residential area with chimneys. Chimneys either cracked or collapsed, and we have in Cupertino 16,000 homes, and we're doing a lot of surveys upon request from the public to check the damage in their homes.
The damage in Cupertino is in sharp contrast to the situation in Los Gatos, where damage totals topped the $500 million mark.
The buildings we have here are relatively new, built to a much higher seismic standard. The old buildings like you're seeing here in the picture, unreinforced masonry buildings, they're built to a standard that just can't handle that type of seismic activity. The buildings today are designed to withstand that kind of a force, and basically that's the difference. We're a new community, Los Gatos is an old community, and that's what's unfortunate about it.
The Loma Prieta Earthquake October 17th was another in a series of quakes which have rocked the Bay Area during the last decade. Since 1979, several quakes of magnitude 5 or greater have hit within a 50-mile radius of Cupertino. The principal fault zones involved are the Calaveras Fault along the east side of the Santa Clara Valley, the Hayward Fault, which runs north along the East Bay through Oakland and Berkeley, and the San Andreas Fault, which lies just a couple miles from Cupertino's westernmost boundary. Scientists are still uncertain as to what all this seismic activity could mean. Records from the 19th century indicate a similarly active period for several decades prior to the 1906 quake. Back then, earthquakes were recorded on the Mercalli scale, which measures the intensity of local ground shaking. The 1906 quake registered a 12 on the Mercalli scale, the highest possible reading. The Loma Prieta quake, by comparison, was only an 8 or a 9 on the Mercalli scale. If a higher magnitude quake were to hit today, stronger and much closer to population centers, emergency response efforts could be stretched to the limit.
Yes, we are better prepared than we were, and certainly we're quite well prepared when compared with someplace like Armenia, where it was just absolute devastation. In talking with building officials, engineers, geologists, other people over the last few years, I get the picture that California really is better prepared than most places. We have especially strong building codes, and that will help a great deal because, as someone said, earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do. So that's the bottom line, keeping something from falling on your head. And in that regard, we are really quite well prepared, especially in a city like Cupertino, where most of the buildings are fairly new.
Things that people need for day-to-day activities.
So they don't even know they've received this service.
We have a real rough and tumble estimate.
As city officials continue to discuss ways to better respond to earthquake disasters, it is still quite apparent that the most effective preparedness measures are those taken by the individual citizen.
The most important thing that we can do is to make sure that our citizens know how to prepare in advance of the earthquake, and that during the aftermath of an earthquake, that they have the ability to sustain themselves for at least 72 hours. That will allow us to gain all of the resources that may be available to us from whatever level of government to make the appropriate response.
The Loma Prieta earthquake October 17th was the strongest quake to hit California in more than 80 years. Most scientists agree, however, that the big one is still yet to come. When we return, we'll be joined by Cupertino City Manager Don Brown, who will give an assessment of the city's response to the earthquake emergency.
Mommy, earthquake!
No, not the doorway, under here. Hold on.
Mommy!
You okay?
And baby too.
Yeah, everybody's okay.
Remember, duck, cover, and hold.
Randy Travis on strings. Branford Marsalis on the horn. Paul Schaefer on keys. Carly Simon on lead. There are a lot of different parts to play in the American Red Cross. Play your part.
To begin the interview segment of our special report, we are now joined by Cupertino City Manager Don Brown. Don, along with other department heads from the city of Cupertino, were on hand at City Hall shortly after the emergency on October 17th, and within a few minutes started responding to the numerous emergency response reports that were coming from throughout the community. Don, if you could take us back 1 year to that date, 5:04 p.m., how did you and the city officials initially respond to the emergency crisis? I know there was some confusion at first regarding the magnitude of the disaster.
That's right, Pete. We, after we let go of whatever we were holding on to and got a little blood circulation back in our hands, we kind of gathered outside City Hall. I remember Bert Viskovich, Public Works Director, and I were standing there and wondering how bad was it. The buildings were still standing that we could see. And about that time, Ben Lopes, the fire district captain, drove up and said it's pretty bad and we should open the EOC, the Emergency Operation Center. And so that's what we did.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain briefly the concept of the Emergency Operations Center? What is it and what was it designed to do?
Okay, the EOC is really designed to be the point of communication and coordination for the entire disaster operation, so that you've got somebody there that has a feel for the whole operation. You're getting responses from people in the field, you're getting reports back, and you're making decisions on the primary activities that ought to be taken at any given time.
Mm-hmm. After the Emergency Operations Center was up and running, how did things proceed from that point on?
Well, it's mostly just gathering information initially. People in the field, sending people out in the field, receiving information from people that were out in the field that came in, and finding out what kind of extensive damage there was in Cupertino. And then also we were monitoring television. We still had television in the EOC. We set up a television camera, or a television set, and watched with horror some of the stuff that was going on in the rest of the Bay Area. And really then, only then, did we realize the significance of the earthquake.
Mm-hmm. How did the magnitude of the damage in Cupertino compare to some other areas in the Bay Area?
Well, we were lucky. We got off with just a few damaged buildings, and we had one loss of life from the diocese property, the seminary up in St. Joseph's, where a telephone worker was in the tower up there that collapsed. We had another gentleman that died shortly after the quake from a heart attack, but not related to any structural damage or anything like that. But building-wise and injuries, we were very lucky, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that Cupertino is a fairly new community in terms of construction, and the building codes have been adhered to very rigorously, and I think that really paid off in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Now, up to this time, the city's emergency response plan had never really been tested. You had numerous exercises to help get prepared for an earthquake, but how did the real thing differ from what you were preparing for in the simulations?
I think the real thing differed in that there was a fair amount of frustration with not knowing what was going on, because we lost telephone ability. And so we had to rely on people that were out in the field being our eyes and ears and letting us know what was going on. The discipline of communication was not well defined, and so we had a lot of information that was wrong or was conflicted with what someone else had told us just 10 minutes earlier. And so I think that was the biggest headache for us, was just sorting out what was going on, getting the communications channels so that we were getting accurate information.
Mm-hmm. Now, scientists are telling us that it's only a matter of time, perhaps less than 30 years, before the big one actually hits. And what they're saying is that this earthquake could be of magnitude 8 or greater, far more damage, far more casualties than we experienced from the Loma Prieta earthquake. Mm-hmm. What will the city be doing in the months and years ahead to help prepare for what's really an inevitable disaster?
Okay, that's a real good question. I think it's one that, as public servants, we have a very high responsibility to address that question. And in the last year, we've in fact, right after the earthquake, we did a fairly extensive debriefing where we went through and we just sort of analyzed, what went on here. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? What things do we need to improve on in the event that something as bad or worse than this comes along in the future? And as you say, it's virtually a certainty that we're going to have at least as bad an earthquake or greater in the coming years. And so what we did was we just sort of took stock in how we behaved as a community in this. And again, mostly I think due to luck, we didn't have a lot of damage, and we had a tremendous citizen response in terms of helping each other and kind of helping direct traffic, avoiding accidents, that sort of thing. But we took some significant steps, I think, in the last year to prepare the city initially, that is us as the command center and our employees, to be able to respond efficiently so that we would be able to be of help to people when they needed it. So that was the number one thing we tried to do, is get our own house in order.
Don, thank you very much for being here today. When we return, we'll talk with Fire Chief Ben Lopes from the Central Fire Protection District as our special report continues in a moment.
Hello. Hi, Dad. Just fine. It was a big quake, but we did okay. No, just a few broken glasses. Maria bolted down our heavy stuff, and we had somebody come out and bolt the house down to the foundation. So don't worry. Yeah, Dad, your nietecita's doing great. Everybody's just fine.
For more information, call your local Office of Emergency Services or the American Red Cross.
Sometimes we're so close to something, we just don't see it clearly. All over the world, people are struggling for liberty, a basic right we already have. No one says we've reached the mountaintop yet, but we have the freedom to be heard. We have the right to vote. Let's not lose sight of freedom.
We are now joined by Deputy Chief of Operation Ben Lopes of the Central Fire Protection District. Within minutes after the earthquake disaster last October 17th, Chief Lopes had already arrived on the scene and was in the process of setting up the Emergency Operation Center. Chief Lopes, what was the situation when you first arrived at Cupertino City Hall?
The situation was that we knew that we had a major earthquake somewhere in the area The details at that time were very sketchy. We didn't know the extent, whether it was local here in Santa Clara County or if it extended further up the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm. When did you first realize the magnitude of the quake?
We set up TV and radio in the Emergency Operations Center and started picking up some of the pictures of the Bay Bridge collapse and some of the information that came out of the World Series, the media being focused in San Francisco at the time. We had no idea at the time of the magnitude of the damage in the Santa Cruz County area.
Mm-hmm. As the evening progressed, what were some of the problems that you ran into? Were you adequately equipped to handle all the incidents that were being reported?
Well, our resources as a fire department were spread about as thin as they could be spread. We had to prioritize incidents based on life first and second property. The backlog at our communications center was probably backed up anywhere from 40 to 50 calls at any given time. So the individual units working at the stations were really setting priorities based on life first.
In terms of the local situation, were there any specific incidents here in Cupertino that, that you needed to respond to quickly?
Yes, immediately following the earthquake, there was a house fire on Orange Blossom. Not knowing the magnitude again at the beginning of the event, I responded to Cupertino feeling that it might be one of the major areas of activity. As it turned out, unfortunately, we did have the problem with the one fire, but the damage was minimal in Cupertino.
Now that you look back on the earthquake, what do you say we've learned from it in terms of, especially in terms of emergency preparedness planning?
In emergency preparedness planning, we have to look at the scope of the event on a regional basis. An earthquake of this magnitude doesn't stop at the city border. The resources that are committed to a particular event, the people that are impacted are really part of a community, and the community is larger than this local area. I think that we've learned that it's not something that abates minutes after the event. It continues on for days, weeks, and sometimes months. So the event is unlike the type of emergency that we as the fire service handle day to day.
Chief Lopes, thank you very much for being here today. When we return, we'll be joined by Pat Jocius. She's the Administrative Specialist for the City of Cupertino, and we'll be talking about earthquake education for residents and businesses. We'll be back in a moment.
I was going to take a job with an engineering firm in New York. I got a better offer. I'm building schools overseas with the Peace Corps. The pace is a little slower than New York, but here I'm getting grassroots experience I couldn't get anywhere else. The way I look at it, the world can wait 2 years for another 40-story smoked glass high-rise.
Peace Corps, the toughest job you'll ever love.
Cupertino is on a limited water supply. Please try and conserve as much water as possible. Thank you.
Cupertino has a limited water supply. Please try and conserve as much water as possible. Thank you.
Well, the suggestions we offer, try to use one bathroom because with the other two you can lock them and use the water in the tanks.
Okay.
If we should have another quake.
Okay.
Also, try and do your laundry once a week.
Okay, bathrooms, laundry.
If you have to water your lawn, do it in the evening hours after 6 p.m. or...
Well, they don't do any of their own.
Okay, if the automatic sprinklers come on, the best time is around midnight, 1 a.m. when the moisture starts to condense, you know, along with your natural watering.
Welcome back to our Earthquake Special. We are joined now by Pat Jocius. She's the Administrative Specialist for the City of Cupertino, and she's been instrumental in educating the public regarding earthquakes and earthquake preparedness measures. Pat, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Steve.
Pat, what did we learn from the Loma Prieta earthquake?
The Loma Prieta earthquake was just a warning of what possibly could happen within the entire Bay Area. We have many earthquake faults, and we've been told that this is just the beginning of possibilities for the future. What we learned specifically for the city of Cupertino is that we have an emergency plan in place and people were able to respond with the responsibilities they have, but that the residents themselves really are the ones who are going to have to take charge of their own environment, their own homes and families, and make sure that they are taken care of first. And then the city is able to augment that with the resources we have.
Do you feel that most of the agencies that had planned for a disaster such as Loma Prieta were prepared when the earthquake actually struck last October?
I think our public safety response agencies, our police and fire, responded very well. This is what they do on a daily basis. They're well practiced. I believe that the Red Cross has things to learn, and I think they were able to respond to the areas of the most damage, which would be in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and they were not able to respond as well within the urban communities, but they did not focus their time and attention there at the time of the earthquake. I think also that the agencies that came forth with the food and the clothing and the other materials almost overdid themselves to the point where we didn't know what to do with many of the resources, and they went to waste in some cases because they were not distributed well enough. So we're working on those plans right now, how to properly distribute materials that come into an area.
From your experiences speaking with members in the community, specifically the residents and individuals, and you've talked to them at workshops and other various seminars, do you feel that people were prepared at the time the Loma Prieta earthquake hit, or could they have been a little better prepared for something like that?
I believe we were very fortunate in this last earthquake. The people that had prepared some things got through just fine. They were very comfortable. I believe in general, though, people do not think about earthquake preparedness, and therefore they have not taken the time to put water aside, to have a little bit of food for 24 to 72 hours, to have a first aid kit, and possibly to take some CPR and first aid classes. The Red Cross found that the classes had gone down several months after the earthquake. People had forgotten, they were not getting the sign-ups, and yet these should be an ongoing process within the community.
What are the points that you try to emphasize in your education programs? I know you talk to neighborhoods as well as individual residents. What is the point you're trying to get across?
The best and most important thing is to have a plan with your family so that you can both evacuate out of an unsafe area as well as taking the drop, cover, and hold position at the immediate time of an earthquake, and then to be able to communicate with them if you're all right. But secondarily, to have supplies on hand so that you'll be able to take care of yourselves. Again, you should have your water heater strapped down. You should also know how to turn off your gas and electricity. But I want to warn the residents that they shouldn't turn the gas off unless they smell gas or whether they see gas lines broken in the street.
With all the seismic activity we've been having lately, we've been feeling little tremors popping up all over. It still seems that some residents feel quite indifferent about earthquakes. Why do you feel that is, and how do we go about educating people as to the severity of, say, what an 8.0 earthquake is?
I think earthquakes, because of their magnitude, sometimes are dismissed from people's minds because they think it's too hard for them to even comprehend and prepare for. And in reality, the earthquakes themselves do not kill people. It's the things coming down on them. It's the lack of preparation and knowing what to do exactly when the earthquake strikes that can save lives and save property. Those are all things that can be prepared for. But people think of it as such a big project to take on that they don't even take the first step. They don't even take little steps that they could do to make a difference in their lives of themselves and their family members. I think that priorities in their lives in such busy society take over, and they just think it's happened now on October 17th. It's not going to happen for another many years. And yet there are forecasters out there telling us that we do have a 67% chance actually on the Hayward-Calaveras fault as well as the San Andreas of an earthquake occurring in the Bay Area. And so we need to prepare for that. This was just a warning. It was just a chance to get more prepared. I think that was a blessing in disguise if people would take it and start doing something.
I'd like to thank once again my guests for this evening, Cupertino City Manager Don Brown, Administrative Specialist Pat Jocius, and Fire Chief Ben Lopes from the Central Fire Protection District. If you have any other information that you would like to learn regarding earthquake preparedness measures, write to the City of Cupertino, 10300 Torrey Avenue, Cupertino, California 95014. Thank you very much for watching and have a good evening.